They laughed the moment I walked in. You could feel it ripple through the air, quiet at first, then swelling into something that filled every corner of the polished conference hall. The sound of amusement, disbelief, superiority. I had heard it before, of course. For years they'd made a sport out of underestimating me. But today the laughter was different. Today they were laughing at a man with a cane, a faded coat, and a limp that carried every year of his 65 on its back. They thought I'd come to beg, to embarrass myself one final time. They didn't know about the folder tucked beneath my coat, pressed close to my heart like a final promise. The echoes of their mockery hit harder than any insult could. The old oak table gleamed between us, reflecting faces I once called family, faces that now smirked behind designer glasses and practiced smiles. My nephew, Brian, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Well, would you look at that? Uncle Martin decided to join us after all." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Laughter followed again. Across from him, his sister, Evelyn, whispered something to her husband, and they both chuckled behind their manicured hands. I said nothing. I simply adjusted my cane, straightened my jacket, and took the empty seat at the far end of the table, the one nobody else had wanted. Before we begin, I heard the attorney say, "Let's make sure everyone signed the attendance form." His voice was calm, detached, professional. He didn't look at me. None of them did. I could see my reflection in the glass wall beside me, the stooped shoulders, the thinning grey hair, the stubborn glint that time had failed to erase. I looked like the past they all wanted to forget. You see, I wasn't always the man with the cane. Once I had been the backbone of this family's business, the quiet accountant who made sure the numbers added up while my brother Charles smiled for the cameras. We built everything together, factories, warehouses, trust. Then Charles died, and his children inherited the spotlight. They inherited everything, really. Everything except integrity. When they pushed me out, they called it a necessary transition, said I was slowing progress. That was 3 years ago. I hadn't seen them since, until today. They'd summoned me through a neatly worded letter to this final reading of the estate matters. I could have ignored it. I almost did, but something in me, a whisper I couldn't silence, told me to show up. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the letter I found last month in the bottom drawer of my desk, written by Charles himself, sealed in an envelope that smelled faintly of his cologne. He'd written it 6 months before his death. Inside was one line, "If they forget where they came from, remind them." And attached to that note was a second envelope, a folder sealed with wax and stamped with our family crest. I hadn't opened it until this morning. Brian's laughter broke my thoughts. "You know, Uncle, I didn't realize you were still walking around. Thought you'd retired to one of those assisted living places." The room chuckled again. I met his eyes and smiled faintly. "Still walking," I said. "Just slower now. Gives me more time to think." My voice was steady. That irritated him. He wanted me defensive, rattled. Instead, I was the calmest I'd been in years. The lawyer cleared his throat. "All right, let's begin. As you all know, your father's holdings and remaining shares have been in probate since his passing. This meeting is to finalize disbursement and close the estate." Brian waved a hand. "Can we skip the formalities? We all know what this is. Let's just sign whatever's needed so we can move on." He grinned at his sister. "Some of us have flights to catch." I rested both hands on my cane and leaned forward slightly. "You should listen," I said quietly. "You'll want to hear everything." The lawyer hesitated, then nodded for silence. I caught the flicker of confusion on a few faces. For the first time that morning, they were looking at me, not with amusement, but curiosity. The attorney began reading the summary of assets, the downtown property, the investment portfolios, the shares of Whitmore Manufacturing, my brother's empire, divided neatly between his 2 children and their families. The list went on, until he paused, frowned slightly, and flipped to another page. "There is an addendum here, dated the week before Mr. Whitmore's passing." The laughter stilled. "It appears to have been filed separately from the main will, but with his notarized signature." He looked up. "Mr. Martin Whitmore is listed as an executor and beneficiary." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the ticking of someone's watch. Brian's chair creaked. "What?" he said finally, his grin faltering. "That can't be right." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "It's right here in the record." The addendum appoints Mr. Martin Whitmore to oversee the reallocation of select assets under Clause 14B, assets pertaining to what's referred to as the legacy holdings. He glanced at me. Mr. Whitmore, I assume you're aware of this? I nodded once. I am. That's when I saw the first crack in their confidence. Evelyn leaned forward. What is this, some sort of joke? She demanded. Dad never mentioned any addendum. You're saying he just changed the will? The attorney looked uncomfortable. Not changed, Mrs. Harrington. Expanded. It appears your father wished to clarify certain matters after his passing. Brian scoffed. Clarify with him? He's been irrelevant for a decade. I met his glare without flinching. Irrelevant doesn't mean uninformed. I could feel the weight of the folder pressing against my ribs beneath the coat. Inside that worn leather cover was the truth, one they'd buried years ago, thinking no one would ever find it. The attorney turned to me again. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any documentation to corroborate this clause? It appears to reference something called the Whitmore Legacy Trust. I stood slowly, leaning on my cane. I do. My hand slipped inside my coat, brushing against the folder's cool surface. For a moment my brother's handwriting flashed before my eyes. If they forget where they came from, remind them. I laid the folder gently on the table. Everything you need to know is in here. And just like that, the laughter stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence after the laughter was louder than the laughter itself. It filled the room like a storm cloud ready to break. I could see the unease crawl across their faces, the way arrogance gave way to suspicion. The folder sat there between us, ordinary, unassuming, yet heavier than any of them could comprehend. It was funny in a way. They'd built their lives on inherited power, but the one thing they never inherited was the truth. The attorney hesitated before continuing. Before we proceed, I must inform everyone that this folder was submitted through my office earlier this morning by Mr. Whitmore. I haven't yet reviewed its contents, but if it pertains to Clause 14B, it is legally admissible. Brian leaned forward, his smirk returning like a reflex. Come on, Uncle. What could you possibly have that changes anything? Dad's assets are settled. You've been living off his pity for years. His tone was dripping with that entitled confidence only men who've never been challenged possess. I didn't respond. I simply opened the folder. Inside were 12 neatly stacked documents, original contracts, notarized letters, and one small black notebook that once belonged to my brother. My hand lingered on the first page. I'd read these words a dozen times in the last week, memorized every detail. Still, reading them again in front of the people who had forgotten their father's principles felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. This, I said, sliding the first page toward the lawyer, is the founding agreement for Whitmore Manufacturing, dated 1986, signed by both partners, Charles Whitmore and Martin Whitmore. It clearly states that all intellectual property and asset rights were to remain jointly held until one partner's death, after which oversight transfers to the surviving founder. The lawyer's brow furrowed. Joint ownership? Yes, my voice was calm. My brother and I built this company together. We started with a single loan and 2 pairs of hands, but when he got sick, his children decided to pretend that my contribution ended when his health did. Brian snorted. So what? That was 40 years ago. Whatever agreement you had is ancient history. The company's been restructured a dozen times since then. Not this clause, I said. Clause 8B in that document states that any restructuring requires the signatures of both founders or their legal representatives. There's no record of mine. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes. You've been operating on a fraudulent restructuring for 3 decades. A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn's husband shifted uncomfortably. The attorney flipped through the document, scanning the dense paragraphs. It appears Mr. Whitmore is correct. The clause was never nullified. Evelyn's voice rose sharp as glass. That's absurd. Dad ran everything. You were just the accountant. I was the accountant, I said softly, and the man who wrote the contracts. I made sure every word was binding, because I knew what greed could do to a family. I gestured to the folder. What's inside is not about me taking back what's mine. It's about restoring what your father meant this family to be. Her face flushed crimson. Don't you dare pretend this is noble, she spat. You're here because you couldn't stand being left out. I leaned forward. Left out? Evelyn, I buried your father's last words while you were busy planning your next investment property. You don't even know what he died trying to fix." The words hung heavy in the air. The attorney cleared his throat awkwardly, breaking the tension. "Mr. Whitmore, there's mention here of a secondary trust, the Whitmore Legacy Trust. Can you explain what that refers to?" "Yes," I said. "The trust wasn't just money. It was a fund your father created for the workers of our factories, scholarships for their children, healthcare for retirees. It was the foundation of his reputation. But after his death, that trust vanished from the books, mysteriously absorbed into corporate operating expenses." Evelyn's husband shifted again, glancing at Brian. "Is that true?" he whispered. Brian's jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous." "There's no proof." "There wasn't," I said, "until I went through the basement archives last month." I opened another page and slid it across the table. "These are transfer receipts, dated 1 month after your father's funeral. Every cent from the Legacy Trust was moved into a private account under your names." Evelyn went pale. Brian's face darkened with fury. "You have no right to dig into our finances." "I had every right," I said evenly. "The trust was never yours. Your father left it in my care legally. But I stayed silent for years, hoping you'd correct it yourselves." "You didn't." The lawyer tapped the papers slowly. "These documents appear legitimate. The account numbers and dates align with the company's old ledgers." He looked up. "If these are authentic, it would mean misappropriation of charitable funds. That's a serious matter." A long pause followed. Brian clenched his fists, his arrogance slipping into something more brittle. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "Even if you're right, there's a statute of limitations." I smiled faintly. "For criminal charges, perhaps. But for moral debts?" I shook my head. "They don't expire." For the first time, no one had a comeback. The power in the room shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, but I could feel it. The cane in my hand no longer felt like a crutch. It felt like a weapon of patience sharpened over time. The attorney placed his glasses on the table. "Mr. Whitmore, there's also a letter here, sealed, addressed to you. Would you like to read it?" I nodded. My hands didn't tremble as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles is bold and steady even in his final days. I began to read aloud. "Martin, if you're reading this, it means the company survived me but not my intentions. I built this empire for the people who believed in us, not the ones who bear our name. If my children forget that, use what I've left you. Remind them who they are. And if you must, take it all back. Not for revenge, but for restoration." "Charles." The room was utterly still when I finished. Even Brian's bravado had drained away. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with something between anger and grief. "You see," I said quietly, folding the letter again, "your father didn't forget me. He trusted me with what mattered most, his conscience." No one spoke. The lawyer reached for his pen. "Given these revelations, I recommend a formal review of the estate before any transfers proceed." Brian slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. You think some old man with a cane can just walk in here and undo everything?" I met his glare. "Not everything," I said. "Just the lies." I gathered the papers and returned them to the folder, the sound of the closing clasp echoing like a gavel. "Your father gave me this to remind you of the truth. You've built towers on rotten soil, and when the ground starts to give way beneath you, don't say you weren't warned." Brian stood, fists shaking. "You think you can take this company back? You're delusional." I pushed myself up, slow but steady, the cane pressing against the polished floor. "I'm not taking it back," I said. "I'm giving it back to the people who earned it." The lawyer looked up sharply. "You mean the employees?" "Yes. The trust will be reinstated immediately. Every cent returned. That was your father's will, his true will." The room erupted in overlapping voices, outrage, disbelief, fear, but I no longer cared for their noise. I turned toward the window, sunlight glinting off the city skyline beyond the glass. I could almost hear my brother's voice beside me, calm and certain. "If they forget where they came from, remind them." I turned back to the table, my voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You laughed when I walked in. But understand this, what I carry isn't power. It's proof. And proof doesn't need to shout." Then, leaning on my cane, I walked out of the room, leaving them with the folder and the echo of their own laughter fading behind me. When I stepped outside that conference room, the air felt heavier, like the building itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. The echo of their argument still carried down the hallway, muffled but furious. I could hear Brian's voice breaking through, sharp and panicked, demanding damage control. I didn't stop. My cane clicked against the marble floor with every step, a steady rhythm that drowned out the noise behind me. After all these years, the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and it was louder than their laughter had ever been. I walked out of the building into the pale winter light. The cold bit into my hands, but it felt good, real, grounding. Across the street stood the same coffee shop my brother and I had visited on lunch breaks decades ago, when we were just starting Whitmore Manufacturing. Back then, we didn't own skyscrapers or boardrooms. Just a rented warehouse, a second-hand truck, and two men foolish enough to think decency could survive in business. He handled people. I handled numbers. Together we balanced each other. Until he started trusting others to handle what we'd built. Inside the cafe, the smell of roasted beans and old wood greeted me like an old friend. I ordered black coffee and sat by the window, the folder resting beside me. For a long while I didn't touch it. I just watched the world move by. People with phones pressed to their ears, couples holding hands, workers on break. They all looked alive in a way that the boardroom never did. The barista, a young woman with inked wrists and tired eyes, brought my coffee. "Rough morning?" she asked with a half-smile. I chuckled softly. "You could say that." She nodded like she understood, though she couldn't possibly. "It gets better after lunch," she said, walking away. I envied her certainty. I opened the folder again, the papers still warm from the confrontation. My brother's handwriting stared back at me. There were more letters, ones I hadn't shown them yet. One addressed to his grandchildren, one to me. And another sealed, marked only with the word confession. I hadn't read that one before. I hesitated, then broke the seal. "Martin, there's one thing I never told you. The company wasn't built as cleanly as you believed. In the early years when we were drowning in debt, I took a contract I shouldn't have. It saved us, but it cost something we never paid back. The man who gave us the loan, his name was Albert Crow. He owned the land our first factory stood on. He made me promise something I shouldn't have agreed to. If anything ever happened to me, the factory would pass to him. I thought I'd outlive him. I was wrong, I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The letter went on. Crow died years ago, but his family still holds those papers. They don't know what they're worth. I hid a copy in the vault. If you find it, you'll understand why I tried to fix things before it was too late. I sat there for a long time staring at that paragraph. So this was it, the missing piece. My brother had built our success on a debt unpaid. And his children, blinded by greed, had nearly buried it completely. The irony was brutal. While they accused me of chasing money, the truth was their fortune rested on a lie they didn't even know existed. The cafe door opened, and a gust of cold air swept in. Someone walked past me, brushing against my shoulder. "Uncle Martin," I looked up. Evelyn stood there, her perfect composure cracking around the edges. Her makeup was smudged and her voice trembled. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "You humiliated us." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down." She hesitated before sitting. For the first time in years, she looked like the little girl who used to bring me lemonade during long nights at the factory. There was a flicker of the person she used to be, before money turned affection into performance. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," I said. "I came here to remind you. Your father's legacy wasn't luxury, it was integrity." Her eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide them. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this mess?" Brian wouldn't listen. "He said you were bluffing. He said the trust didn't matter anymore. Does it matter to you?" I asked. She hesitated. "It did once." She stared out the window. "You know what it's like, Uncle Martin, to live your whole life being told you have to be ruthless or get left behind. Dad used to tell us kindness doesn't pay dividends." "He told you that," I said slowly, "because he didn't want you to repeat his mistakes." Her eyes widened. "Mistakes?" I handed her the letter. She read in silence. I watched her lips part, her fingers trembling as the truth sank in. When she finally looked up, she whispered, "He lied to us." "No," I said. "He lied to himself. Until he couldn't anymore." Evelyn folded the letter carefully. "What happens now?" "The company owes a debt," I said. And we're going to pay it, she laughed bitterly. Brian will never agree. He won't have a choice. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence between us stretch. You can help fix this, Evelyn. Or you can keep pretending none of it matters. She stood slowly, wiping her eyes. I don't know if I can undo what we did, then start by not making it worse. As she left, I looked down at the letter again. The name Crow echoed in my mind. I had heard it before. The Crow family still owned a small industrial estate outside the city, one of the last properties never acquired by Whitmore Manufacturing. If my brother was right, the original deed was hidden there. The truth wasn't finished revealing itself. That night, I drove out to the outskirts, to the old factory road where Whitmore Manufacturing had been born. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows over rusted gates and broken windows. The factory was a skeleton now, hollow and forgotten, just like the promises made there. But it was still ours. At least it was supposed to be. I found the vault where Charles and I used to store records. The door was rusted, the combination lock stiff, but my hands remembered the numbers. When it opened, a smell of metal and dust filled the air. Inside were ledgers, contracts, and one small tin box. My brother's initials were carved into it. I lifted the lid. Inside lay the deed he'd mentioned, a copy of the original ownership transfer. The name Albert Crow was there, signed and sealed, but beneath it was something else. A second document dated years later, transferring the property back to Whitmore Manufacturing, signed not by Charles, but by me. I frowned. I had never signed such a thing. The signature was perfect. Too perfect. I realized then what had happened. Someone had forged my name to cover up the debt, to make the contract disappear from the books. And only one person would have had access to those files at the time, Brian. My chest tightened with anger and betrayal. He hadn't just stolen money. He'd falsified history to erase accountability. Everything he'd built his arrogance on was counterfeit. As I stood in that cold, empty factory, the weight of years pressed down on me. My brother's ghost was everywhere, his laughter, his stubbornness, his guilt. I whispered into the silence, I found it, Charles. I know what you did. And I'll finish what you started. When I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, scattering dust across the cracked pavement. I could see the skyline of the city glowing faintly in the distance, the empire our family had built, shining like a monument to both creation and corruption. I tightened my grip on the cane. Tomorrow they would all know. The board, the family, the shareholders. This time I wouldn't walk into their laughter. I would walk into their silence, because truth, once uncovered, doesn't whisper, it roars. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. The legal office must have leaked something, or maybe one of the board members couldn't keep their mouth shut. My phone was flooded with messages. Reporters, ex-colleagues, even old friends who had once disappeared when the company cut me out. Martin, what's happening? Is it true about the trust? Are you really taking them to court? I didn't answer any of them. Not yet. I spent the night organizing the evidence. Every document, every letter, every signature was laid out across my small living room table, like a map of betrayal. The folder that once felt like a burden now looked like a weapon, carefully crafted, meticulously aimed. My brother's words echoed in my head. If they forget where they came from, remind them. I realized he hadn't meant only Evelyn and Brian. He had meant all of them. The generations who built fortunes and forgot foundations. At 9 a.m., I called the lawyer. There's more, I said simply. We need a full audit of the company's financial and property history. Every deed, every transfer, every amendment signed after my brother's death, especially those bearing my signature. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, understood. The audit began immediately. And within hours, the rot surfaced like a corpse rising through still water. Forged signatures, hidden accounts, dummy contracts transferring assets to shell corporations that linked back to Brian. Every lie was a thread, and once pulled, the whole fabric came apart. By noon, the company board was in emergency session. I wasn't invited, of course. They hadn't realized yet that I no longer needed an invitation, but I showed up anyway. The boardroom was filled with tension when I entered. Men and women in tailored suits glanced at me, as though I were a ghost who had wandered in from another era. Brian sat at the head of the table, pale and sleepless. his usual confidence stripped bare. Evelyn was there too, quiet and watchful. The chairman, a nervous man named Gerald, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, we weren't expecting you." I leaned on my cane and walked to the center of the room. "You should start expecting me, Gerald. Because this meeting is about me, and about what this company did in my name." Brian's jaw tightened. "You have no right to be here. This is a private meeting." "Private?" I smiled thinly. "You mean like the private accounts you opened under false names? Or the private deals that funneled company assets into your personal ventures?" He slammed his hand on the table. "Those are baseless accusations." "Baseless?" I set the folder down and slid out a single document. "Here's a property transfer dated 2014, the signature next to my name, not mine. And this," I said, pulling another, "a loan authorization for $10 million signed under my authority while I was in the hospital. You remember that year, don't you, Brian? The one where you called to wish me well while quietly rewriting the company's past." Gasps rippled through the board. Gerald stood, his hands shaking as he examined the papers. These appear authentic." "They are," I said. "The ink matches company archives. The signatures, flawless forgeries produced by someone with access to the original digital seal. That access only belonged to two people, me and Brian." Brian's face flushed with anger. "So you can't prove that?" I took a deep breath. "Oh, but I can." From my coat pocket, I pulled a small USB drive and set it on the table. "This contains the audit logs from the internal network. Every login, every digital authorization, including yours. It took the IT department 2 hours to trace your credentials back to the day those documents were filed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn looked at her brother, horror dawning in her eyes. "Brian," she whispered, "tell me you didn't." He looked away. I stepped closer to him. "You could have fixed this," I said softly. "You could have chosen to make things right. Instead, you turned our name into a synonym for theft." He finally looked at me, eyes burning. "You think you're some kind of saint? You think you can lecture me after abandoning this company? You left us to handle it all while you played the martyr." "I left," I said, "because your father asked me to. He wanted you to learn what leadership costs. But you never learned. You mistook inheritance for ability, and now you'll face the price." The chairman cleared his throat again, voice unsteady. "Mr. Brian Whitmore, these are grave accusations. Until this is resolved, I'm suspending your authority as acting CEO pending investigation." Brian jumped to his feet. "You can't do this. I built this company." I met his glare. "No, you built a monument to greed. Your father built the company." He started to speak again, but Evelyn rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He's right, Brian, it's over." Brian turned on her, betrayal etched across his face. "You're siding with him?" "I'm siding with Dad," she said quietly. "With the truth." He stared at her for a long time, then stormed out, the door slamming behind him. When the echo faded, I looked around the room. "This company can still be saved," I said, "but not by hiding the truth. By facing it." Gerald nodded weakly. "What do you propose?" "Reinstate the legacy trust, full transparency audit. Every cent returned. Every falsified record corrected. Publish the findings publicly. No PR spin. No excuses." There were murmurs, hesitant but hopeful. They were beginning to see it, not as destruction but as renewal. I turned to leave, but Gerald stopped me. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "if I may ask, why now? Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I paused at the doorway. "Because silence has a cost. And I've paid it long enough." By evening, the news had broken. Whitmore manufacturing scandal. Founder's heir accused of forgery and embezzlement. My phone didn't stop ringing. I ignored the noise, the praise, the outrage. It wasn't about me anymore. But that night, when I returned home, there was one message that made me stop cold. It was from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "You forgot us." At first I thought it was spam, some cruel stranger echoing headlines. But then another message came. "Crow family never forgets." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The Crow name, the one from my brother's confession, the one tied to the unpaid debt that had started everything. My phone buzzed again, a picture this time. A photograph of the old factory, the one I'd visited the night before. Only now the lights inside were on. A chill ran through me. I grabbed my coat and cane and drove back to the outskirts. The road was darker this time, the sky split by lightning in the distance. As I approached the factory gates, I saw the faint glow spilling from the broken windows. The same tin box I had opened the night before now sat on the ground near the entrance, its lid open, papers scattered in the wind. Someone had been here. I stepped inside. The sound of my cane echoed through the empty hall, mingling with the dripping of water from a leaking pipe. The air smelled of rust and rain. On the far wall, spray-painted in red, were the words, "Pay what's owed." My heart pounded. I moved closer, scanning the floor. There were footprints, fresh ones leading toward the old office at the back. I followed them, the sound of thunder growing louder outside. Inside the office, a single envelope sat on the desk, addressed to me. My name written in bold letters, Martin Whitmore. I tore it open. We know the truth now. What your brother owed, you owe too. You exposed your family's sins to cleanse your conscience, but debts don't disappear in paperwork. The land was ours before it was yours. The Crow name was buried, so the Whitmore name could rise. Now we're taking it back. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow move near the doorway, but when I turned there was no one there, only the whisper of the wind. I pocketed the letter and stepped outside into the storm. The red words on the wall gleamed wet under the rain. Pay what's owed. As thunder cracked overhead, I realized something that made the hair on my neck stand on end. This wasn't over. Exposing Brian had lit a fuse, but the real fire was still coming, and it had been waiting 40 years to burn. The storm didn't ease that night. It raged on like something ancient and restless had finally stirred awake. I barely slept. Every crash of thunder rattled through my chest, blending with the thoughts that refused to settle. The Crow family, they were still out there, still waiting. And now they had resurfaced, not with demands but with threats. For 40 years they had been silent ghosts beneath our success, watching the Whitmore name rise on land that was never truly ours. At dawn, I stood by my window, the city washed in grey. I could see the headlines flashing across news tickers on distant screens. Brian Whitmore resigns amid scandal. Legacy trust reinstated. Founder's brother exposes decades of fraud. The world thought justice had been done, but they didn't know the full story. Not the part written in a dead man's promise and sealed in a contract older than most of them. Not the part that was now coming due. I brewed coffee, black and strong, then opened the letter from the Crows again. The words still bled menace. Pay what's owed. Below that line I noticed something I hadn't before, faint numbers written in pencil, half erased by rain. 2189 A7. It looked like a file reference. My brother had used similar markings for storage archives decades ago. If the Crows had those numbers, it meant they had access to something from inside the company's own vault system. I dressed quickly and made my way back downtown. The rain had calmed, but the sky remained heavy, brooding. At the company headquarters, the lobby receptionist looked startled to see me again. "Mr. Whitmore, so we weren't expecting—" "I don't need an appointment," I interrupted gently. "Just access to the lower archives. File series A7. She hesitated, then nodded, calling security to escort me. The archive room sat deep beneath the main building, concrete walls sweating with humidity. I had walked these corridors long ago, back when records were stored in paper and ink, not encrypted drives. Dust coated the air like memory. The file cabinet marked 2189A7 was at the far end. My cane clacked softly against the floor as I approached. The drawer groaned open, and there it was, a sealed envelope stamped with the old Whitmore crest, and another mark beneath it, one I'd never seen before. A crow wings outstretched. I tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, yellowed but legible. My brother's handwriting again, uneven this time, as though written in haste. "If you're reading this, it means the Crows came back. I tried to make peace before I died, but they wouldn't accept it. They said the debt could only be paid in kind, not with money, but with acknowledgement. They wanted the truth made public. I was too proud. I thought burying it would protect our name. I was wrong." My pulse quickened as I read the next lines. "There's one last document, the original contract signed between me and Albert Crow. It's hidden where it began, the first factory floor, beneath the ledger desk. If they find it before you do, it'll destroy everything. If you find it first, end this properly. Tell their family what I couldn't." I folded the letter carefully, my hands trembling. My brother had tried to silence the past, and now the past was roaring back through his grave. I knew what I had to do. The Crows wanted acknowledgement. They wanted their name restored, their claim honored. Maybe if I faced them directly, it could finally end. That evening, I drove once more to the outskirts. The factory loomed against the fading sky like a monument to guilt. The words, "Pay what's owed," were still scrawled across the wall, dark against the cracked concrete. I pushed through the heavy doors, the air inside thick with the smell of oil and rust. The ledger desk sat where it always had, warped with age, corners splintered. I knelt beside it, ignoring the pain in my knees, and began prying up the wooden floorboards underneath. Beneath the dust and decay, my cane struck metal, a small safe half buried in the foundation. The lock was rusted, but time had weakened it. One sharp strike with the cane's tip, and it broke open. Inside lay a stack of brittle papers and an old photograph. The image showed two men, my brother, younger and proud, and another man beside him, Albert Crow. Their hands were clasped in a handshake, both smiling. On the back of the photo, a note read, "Partners, not enemies. 1986. I lifted the contract from beneath it. The ink was faded, but the intent was clear. It was the original land agreement. The factory site had been loaned, not sold, on a 50-year lease with the condition of renewal through shared ownership. In simpler terms, the Crow family still legally owned half the land beneath the entire Whitmore industrial complex. My breath caught. If this became public, the company wouldn't survive another scandal. Shareholders would flee. Lawsuits would multiply. The name Whitmore would finally fall. A voice broke the silence behind me. "I was hoping you'd find it first." I turned sharply. A man stood in the doorway, tall, mid-40s, soaked from the rain. His face was hard but familiar somehow, like a shadow of the past. "You're a Crow," I said. He nodded. "Jacob Crow, Albert's grandson." I stayed silent, gripping my cane. He stepped closer, hands raised. "Don't worry, I didn't come here to threaten you. My family's angry, but I came to end this the way it should have been ended years ago." "What do you want?" I asked. "Truth," he said simply, "and acknowledgement. My grandfather helped build this place. Your brother took the credit, then erased his name. All we ever wanted was that truth to see the light of day." I looked down at the papers. "You could have gone to the press," he shook his head, "and start another Whitmore scandal. No, that's not justice. That's vengeance. I don't want to ruin what's left of this legacy. I want it made right." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain drummed against the tin roof. My brother's letter burned in my pocket. "You'll have your acknowledgement," I said finally. "The contract will be released publicly. Your grandfather's name will be restored in every record. Half of the factory's proceeds will go to the Crow Foundation in his honor." Jacob studied me, his expression softening. "That's more than I expected." "It's what's owed," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose this feud can finally rest." We stood there in silence, two old families bound by one broken promise. Then Jacob extended his hand. For the first time, no lies between us. I took it. No lies. When I returned to the city the next morning, I met with the board once more. Evelyn was there, her eyes tired but hopeful. Brian's seat sat empty. I laid the contract on the table. "This is the final truth," I said. "Our company stands on borrowed ground. From this day forward, we acknowledge it, publicly and permanently. The Crow family's share will be honored." There was silence, then slow nods of agreement. The chairman spoke first. "And you, Mr. Whitmore, what will you do now?" I smiled faintly. What I should have done long ago. "Step away." Evelyn reached for my hand. "You're leaving?" "I was never meant to stay," I said softly. "My job was to remind everyone where we came from, and now that they remember, my work is done." As I left the boardroom for the final time, the morning sun broke through the clouds, painting the glass walls gold. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the ghosts we had just laid to rest. My cane tapped rhythmically against the marble floor, each step lighter than the last. In my coat pocket, the folder rested quietly. No more secrets inside, only the letters I'd chosen to keep. My brother's final apology, the Crow contract, and a small note I'd written myself. Justice isn't about taking back what's yours. It's about giving back what was never yours to keep. I mailed copies of every document to the archives that afternoon, ensuring the record would never be buried again. Then I walked to the same cafe where it had all begun. The same barista smiled at me. "You look like you just finished something important," she said. I nodded. "Something overdue." She poured my coffee. "So what's next?" I looked out the window, the skyline gleaming like a clean slate. "Rest," I said, "and remembering." As I sipped the bitter coffee, I thought of my brother, of Evelyn, of Jacob Crow, of laughter that had once filled rooms now emptied of lies. The cane rested beside me, silent witness to it all. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of carrying the truth. The folder had done its work. The laughter was gone. Only respect remained. A season passed before anyone realized the storm had changed the color of the sky. Winter's iron light softened into spring, and with it the city learned to say our name without bracing for scandal. The first sign was small. A notice in the business section about the Whitmore-Crowe Accord, buried under ribbon cuttings and shipping numbers. Then came a longer piece, one of those Sunday articles that tries to measure a century with a cup of coffee, about promises, land, and the sort of paperwork that outlives the people who sign it. They called it restorative governance. I just called it finally telling the truth out loud. I walked more now. The cane still tapped its slow metronome, but the ache behind it had loosened. Some mornings I took the long way to the cafe, past the courthouse and the bronze soldier that pigeons used for a throne. People stopped me sometimes, an engineer from the plant, a woman whose father had retired on the old trust, a security guard who'd worked nights through the lean years, and they knew my name again without squinting at the past. They didn't thank me for bringing anything down. They thanked me for putting something back. The board moved quickly. Evelyn chaired the disclosure committee with a steadiness I had not seen in her since she was a girl counting barrels in an August heatwave. The audit was published in full, every forged signature marked, every improper transfer unwound. The legacy trust refilled in a single wire that blinked midnight into morning. The clinic lines shortened. Scholarship letters found kitchens that had only ever received bills. At the old factory, scaffolds rose like ribs in a chest that was learning to breathe again. The plaque on the new brick read simple enough for truth. Whitmore-Crowe Foundry, built by hands that kept their word. As for Brian, the noise around him, the one he used like scent and armor, faded. Investigations do not arrive like thunder. They arrive like a knock you can hear coming from down the hall. He gave interviews that did not land, tried apologies that turned to dust mid-sentence. When the indictments came, it was on a Thursday, with the city pretending the rain wasn't real. The paper called it a reckoning. I didn't clip the headline. Some reckonings are private, even when the whole street can see them. I sent one letter, no triumph, no sermon, just 10 lines about the cost of shortcuts, and the last line was the first my brother had taught us. Every number is a person, if you write it out long enough. Jacob and I met twice more before summer, once in the shade of the rebuilt loading bay, once beside the ledger desk that was no longer a hiding place. He had shoulders that made you expect trouble, and eyes that made you expect mercy. Some of my cousins wanted more, he admitted, tracing the grain of the new wood. Money does that to old anger. But when the plaque went up, the yelling stopped. It's hard to argue with your own name being told the right way. He laughed, not a sharp sound, not a victory, just something unburdened, and asked if I would speak at the unveiling. I told him I'd try. I told him the cane made stairs and podiums into mountains. He told me they'd build a ramp. We shook hands on that like it was a treaty. The day of the unveiling smelled like hot iron and lemonade. Children wove between adults who knew each other from work and from funerals. A brass trio tuned itself into courage. Reporters hovered, hunting for the sentence that would convert hard years into a headline. I did not bring the folder. It lay at home in a drawer beside cufflinks, and a photograph of 2 boys who used to believe integrity could be counted, not only felt. Instead, I brought a scrap of paper with a few words I might say if my voice didn't find me when I needed it. When they called my name, I took the ramp slower than pride would have liked and faster than fear expected. I stood with the microphone tilted just enough that my breath didn't argue with it. The faces were a sea and a shore. I spoke the way you speak, when your body remembers rooms that laughed before they listened. I came here once with a secret, I said. It wasn't mine to keep, and it wasn't theirs to own. It belonged to everyone who ever hung a coat in a locker, and called that square of air a living. Paper can hide a promise for a while, but not for always. The ground remembers, names remember, and families, if they are brave, remember aloud. I saw Evelyn near the front, a biro tucked behind her ear out of habit. I saw Jacob with his hands folded, like he was making room for a prayer without asking it to wear a suit. I saw the barista from the cafe on her lunch break. I saw men who had forgiven the factory for the ways it had aged them, and women who had forgiven the city for the ways it had not. "We didn't win anything today," I said. "We returned something. That's all. And it is enough." I stepped aside, and Evelyn read the names of the new nursing scholarships like each one was a bell. The brass trio made a song out of steel and sunlight. Jacob unveiled the plaque. The crowd did the math silently, the kind that adds past to present and calls it future. That evening I walked the perimeter alone, the way I used to do when inventory felt like meditation. The cane found the rhythm of a shift whistle I hadn't heard in years. I touched the brick and felt both heat and history in it. On the far wall beneath a fresh coat of paint, you could still make out the faintest ghost of older letters. Pay what's owed. They hadn't scrubbed it completely. Good. Not everything should be polished to forgetfulness. At home. The drawer didn't protest when I slid it open. I lifted the folder, heavier now in the way a book is heavier after you've read it. Inside the letters lay patient. My brother's apology that never learned to stand up straight, the contract whose edges had cut our hands for decades, the note I'd written to nobody in particular. I added one more page, brief like certainty, and left it on top, to whoever finds this after I'm gone. Your proof is only as good as your willingness to live by it. If you're holding this, it means you have both. Do not confuse silence with peace. Do not confuse noise with victory. And if they laugh when you enter the room, let them finish. Then set your folder down and make the room honest. I closed the drawer and turned off the light. Night folded the city into something that could sleep. In the parking lot below, a security guard's flashlight stitched a line across darkness, like a signature refusing to be forged. The next morning, the cafe girl slid my cup over the counter before I asked. "You look taller on the news," she teased. "Then the camera is kinder than memory," I said, and she laughed. Outside, the air had that two-part smell you only get in a city that remembers its work. Hot metal and lilacs. A delivery truck idled, while a driver checked a clipboard that had become a cousin of law. A boy on a scooter traced circles in a square of shade. His mother kept moving, as if to convince time to rest. Across the street, a man lowered a ladder and raised a sign. It wasn't new, just truer. The old serif Whitmore was still there, but next to it its shadow made flesh, crow, not smaller. Not an asterisk. Not a museum label. Just a name that had waited long enough. I stood there longer than the light allowed, letting horns instruct me back into motion. When I finally crossed, my cane ticked its tempo, and for once the world kept time with it. Inside the lobby, a receptionist with a new badge and an old kindness nodded the way people nod at funerals and births. The two events that teach us how to look at each other. "You don't have a meeting." "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently. "I know," I replied. "Sometimes you come to a building just to see if it learned anything." She smiled. "Did it?" "It's learning," I said. "That will do." On the way out, a child pressed his palm to the glass and left a print that looked like a crown when the sun hit it. I thought of my brother and the boy he had been, of Jacob and the man he had decided to be, of Evelyn teaching a room to listen by staying quiet until the right sentence arrived. I thought of the folder and felt, for the first time, that it could be put away without being forgotten. I walked home by a different street, one that passed a school where a janitor was oiling the hinges of a door that squeaked. He let the silence stretch after each test, swing the way a craftsman lets a room tell him when it's done. The door sighed, settled, and held. He looked pleased in that private way people get when something finally closes correctly. So did I at the corner. A breeze carried the smell of cut grass and the promise of rain that would come in its own time without being asked to perform. I thought about laughter. How it had once met me like a wall and now met me like weather. Present, passing, not in charge of the day. I thought about rooms and who they belonged to. And I thought about the next person who would stand at a table, hand on a folder, while the chuckles practiced their choreography. I hoped they'd remember this. You don't have to raise your voice when the facts have weight. You don't have to match their volume. Gravity is quiet. So is a signature. So is a cane. By noon, the sky cleared the way debt clears when it has finally been named. I turned the last corner toward home and did not look back. Not because there was nothing to see, but because the city was looking forward without me. It is a good thing to be unnecessary to the truth you made possible. It means the truth is doing its work. The folder remained in the drawer. The plaque stayed on the wall. The trust paid its bills like clockwork. The ground held. The names held. And laughter, when it returned, and it always does, found itself careful, as if even it had learned the difference between noise and music. That was enough. And it was everything. It's strange how quiet a life can become once truth finishes its work. Months have passed since the last meeting, and the world kept spinning as if none of it had ever made the front page. The Whitmore-Crowe partnership grew into something real. Factories rehired workers, scholarships expanded, and people spoke our names together without tension. Even the laughter that once followed me into rooms feels distant now, a sound from another man's story. Some nights, I still dream of that day, the cane tapping, the folder opening, the hush that followed, when arrogance finally met its mirror. I remember Brian's eyes when realization set in, and Evelyn's trembling voice finding its way back to courage. It wasn't victory that I felt then, it was release. Like setting down a burden I had carried for decades, one letter at a time. I kept the folder locked away, but I no longer fear what's inside. The papers are just reminders now, ink and ghosts sharing space. The true inheritance wasn't the land or the trust or the money. It was accountability, and that, I learned, is the rarest form of wealth. Sometimes I walk past the factory at dusk. The new sign gleams in fading light. Whitmore-Crowe Foundry, built on shared honor. Children run along the fence, chasing each other through the hum of machinery. I pause and listen, and for the first time the laughter doesn't sting. It heals. I think about my brother often. I think about what he wanted and what he feared. I used to believe his letter was a curse. Now I see it was permission. Permission to forgive, to confront, to restore. He left me the truth, and that truth restored not just a company, but a conscience. Tomorrow I'll send Evelyn the last copy of his confession for the family archives. Then I'll return to my small apartment, pour a cup of coffee, and finally close the drawer where the folder rests. The story has been told. The debts are named. The ground beneath us, for the first time in half a century, belongs to no one and everyone at once. If there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. The world doesn't need louder people, it needs quieter proofs. Because laughter fades, money vanishes. But truth once spoken doesn't die, it settles. Like dust after a storm. Like peace after noise. And when I walk away from the building for the last time, cane steady, heart light, I'll whisper what my brother wrote all those years ago. If they forget where they came from, remind them.